What we're going to do today is talk about the two continental congresses that the United States had before they became the United States. So this was during the colonial period in the war and right afterwards. So I want you to listen because people get these confused and it's really simple. So let's try and simplify it as much as we can. How do you keep separate which one is which and what they did? Well, the simple thing to remember, to help you remember, is that the First Continental Congress was called in 1774 in response to the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts. Now, you know when all these acts happened. What year did the Intolerable Acts happen?
1775.
Okay, so the same year, 1774, that you have the Intolerable Acts, or the Townshend Acts was what caused it, the Townshend Acts, and they passed the Intolerable Act in response. Okay, they passed that in 1774. Who can tell me why that worried the colonists so much and upset them? What were they doing?
Because they thought if they could tax small stuff like that, they not.
Right, and do you remember what the British did with the Intolerable Acts, what they did to the colonists? Does anybody?
Closed down the front.
Yes, closed down the harbor. Now, this was a town, a shipping town with a great harbor that traded everywhere. Even though Britain said they could only trade with Britain, they didn't do that. And because Britain was upset, they passed these acts and closed the harbor. So the colonists felt like, let me turn that off, like little kids who'd gotten their hands smacked, you know. We're going to give you time out. Now you can't use your harbor. Well, that wasn't a little thing. That was their livelihood. That's how they existed. And so the colonists were very concerned, and what they did is they called prominent members from every one of the colonies to come to this meeting, and they called it the First Continental Congress. Why would they call it a Continental Congress?
Because it's on the continent.
It's on the continent and include everybody they knew about on the continent. So since it wasn't a colony congress with just one colony, it was all of them. They called it Continental Congress. Well, the First Continental Congress, all they wanted to do is discuss how should we respond to this horrible thing that Britain just did to us. What shall we do? So that's what the first one was about. It met in 74. There were very prominent people there. The two Adams cousins, Samuel and John, were there. George Washington was there. Patrick Henry was there. And they finished what came out of this one. Now remember, the First Continental Congress, they're still thinking about maybe making amends with Great Britain and staying British. They haven't given up quite yet. And so they write a paper, John Adams authors it, and it's called the Declaration of, what, does anyone know? Not that one yet.
No.
Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Yes, that's right. So here they pointed out to the king that he was violating their natural rights. He was violating with them rights that they should have had that his subjects in England had. And so this marked a real turning point in the relationship with Great Britain, because even though they'd called and said, hello, George. No, they'd written letters and they had asked King George very respectfully, oh, King George, could we have this? Could we do that? This time the tone changed, because this time they pointed out to him what he was doing wrong. Now this was a big, brave thing for them to do, and they were just saying, hey, this violates not only our natural rights, but the principles of the English law. You're not even treating us like, if we're your citizens, treat us like your citizens. Everybody else has representation, for example. We don't. And so they're finally pointing out that King George is doing it wrong. Now, I don't know how your parents are, but if I pointed out to my parents that they were doing it wrong, it didn't go over really well. How about you guys? No, Mom, you're wrong. I should be able to go to that party. You got it all messed up. You're violating my personal rights. How would your parents react?
I would die.
All right, so that's how King George felt. He felt like his kid was sassing him, sort of. He didn't agree with it. He thought it was wrong. But now they have written this Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And what that does is they are saying to the king, what we're doing is legal. We're protesting a wrong. So this I'm sure, really set George on edge. I don't think he liked it. They needed some way to govern themselves until they figured out what to do. So they wrote America's first actual constitution. You know, the constitution that they labored over so hard in 1787 in Philadelphia was a great constitution, but this one was thrown together by the delegates, and they did their best, and they called it the Articles of Confederation. Now, what does that mean? To keep things simple, a confederation is when different people group together. What were you going to say, Tony?
Where states could like have power over themselves, mostly. Like there is more power in the state government than the federal government.
For the word confederation? It could be used in that case, but the word confederation itself means a group of something, a group that comes together. In this instant, it was a group of colonies. So they'd formed this confederation. At this point, like Tony was saying, at this point, they saw themselves as individual countries. They really did. But they were joining with the other countries for a necessary purpose, and that was working this thing out with England. So the articles, the points that they were unhappy about or that they thought they needed to do to manage their own country, these Articles of Confederation said, okay, everybody, we're going to decide how we're going to operate through this crisis. What are we going to do? So in your paper it says the first official constitution. They dictated a loose organization of 13 independent states joined together with equal representation in order to provide for the common defense. When they wrote these Articles of Confederation, they were looking down the road and they were saying, you know what's going to happen to us if George doesn't like this? In fact, already in 1774, there was a naval battery from Britain that was coming to the colonies. There were soldiers being sent over. Who was that for? Did Great Britain have enemies in that area?
No.
No. The colonists, as Patrick Henry said in his speech, no, it is for us. It can only be for us. This is the last thing a king does when he's not getting his way, is he uses force. And so they could see the dark clouds, you know, coming overhead, and they said, you know what, we better be ready. We'd like to work this out. Hopefully King George will respond well to our Declaration of Rights and Grievances, but let's prepare for the common defense. What are we going to do? Now, the Articles were too weak to really continue to be our Constitution. For one thing, you can't run a government without money or a military. I mean, you think about it. Do any of you know someone in the military? Who knows someone in the military? Do they get paid? Yeah, they get paid. Do you think they'd stay if they weren't getting paid? No. I know my daughter wouldn't. They wouldn't stay if they weren't getting paid. Do they have uniforms? Okay. They have food that they're fed and training. That all costs money. And the Articles of Confederation had no way to provide income. So you can see how that wouldn't last very long. And it had some other weaknesses. So even before, the Articles of Confederation lasted us through the whole war. And the war ended in 1781. You know that with the Battle of Yorktown. And several years later, when they were meeting at Annapolis, they decided they needed to set up another constitutional convention, and that's the one that was set up that we all know about in 1787. So the first, if I said to you on a quiz, if I had a list of things and you had to put first or second, which one it came out of, if I said Declaration of Rights and Grievances, what would you say? First, okay. If I said didn't have any way to get money, what would you say? If I said was preparing to defend the colonies, what would that be? The first. Now let's look at the second, and this is neatly listed for you here exactly what the successes and the failure of the Second Continental Congress were. But the Second Continental Congress was convened in response to Lexington and Concord. So the shot fired, or heard around the world as we call it, that was fired at Lexington, well, now they were in deep stuff. War had started. They'd actually had a battle. So they called another Continental Congress. Well, they'd already had one So they had to call this one the Second Continental Congress. So if you remember, the first one was in response to the Intolerable Acts. The second one was in response to Lexington and Concord. And delegates from all 13 colonies came to this one. In the first one, Georgia declined. They didn't want to be part of it. But by now, they're all there. And the desire to avoid war is still strong, but war's already started. So now they have to meet and decide what to do. How are they going to defend themselves? What are they going to do? They did try another attempt to appease the king. They sent him an olive branch petition. Now, what does the olive branch typically stand for? Peace. The dove of peace carries the olive branch. You see it on peace signs all over the place. So the olive branch was their way of saying, we're still reaching out. Now they asked Thomas Jefferson to write it because he was a very good writer, but by then his emotions were so worked up that it was really harsh, and one of the other members decided to rewrite it because it sounded pretty harsh. So John Dickinson wrote it. And then sent it. The king he rejected that. So that didn't work out at all. But you see, even after a battle had started, they were still considering, here's our olive branch. Can we work this out peacefully? Can we avoid war? So what was the Second Continental Congress in response to? Bill, what were they responding to when they decided to have the Second Continental Congress? What I just talked about. Who can help him? Okay, Tony?
The shouts from Lexington.
Right, the beginning of war. All of a sudden there was a battle and they decided they better meet and talk about it. What was the first one called in response to? Tony G. The First Continental Congress was called when what happened? Yes, response to the Intolerable Acts. Who passed the Intolerable Acts? The colonies or Great Britain? Right. Great Britain said, smack your hand, we're closing your harbor. Well, that didn't go over. So that called the first one. The second one was in response to the fact that war had already really started. Okay, on page 7 in your handout, there is a list of the successes and failures of the Second Continental Congress. Oh, I see. It's the one that says Second Continental Congress successes and failures. What page is that on? Page 5. On page 5. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so let's look at what they did right. Now, I have to say that the First Continental Congress did get us through the war, and even though the men were often hungry and their clothes were ragged, they did keep them with ammunition, which was a big success for the First Continental Congress. How did they do that mostly? Who did they appeal to for help with that? Yes, because of France sending so much ammunition and helping, we were able to at least keep the army supplied for its defense, but they didn't always have good food or other good conditions. They didn't have, like you see a soldier today with his waterproof clothes and his neat little rolled up sleeping bag and, you know, his nice shiny gun and his helmet. They didn't have all that. Some of them were in rags, but they still defended the right for us to be a free country. All right, so let's look now at the Second Continental Congress. I want to just look at what they did right. They did establish our first Army and Navy and Marines. So those branches of the military have existed since the beginning of our country. Later we got the Air Force and the Coast Guard. But the original and the oldest established military branch is the Army. They had the good judgment to appoint George Washington to lead the Army. They kept them supplied with ammunition throughout the war. Okay, now it's talking about them keeping them supplied. And that's true because Second Continental Congress was one of the first things that happened after Lexington and Concord. So when I said the First Continental Congress kept them supplied with ammunition and stuff, that was wrong. It was the second. Because when did the Second Continental Congress get called? What date? Same day as the date as the Intolerable Acts. 17 what? 17? The Second Continental Congress. Remember, it was after the shot that was fired. So what do you think? 1775. I'm mixing them up myself. How do I expect you to keep them straight? Okay, so the First Continental Congress was in response to the Intolerable Acts in 74. The second one was response to the shooting in 75. And the war ended what year? 81. So from 75 to 81, it was the Second Continental Congress who reached out to France and kept them supplied with ammunition. They created a postal service. Why in a time of war were they bothering with the postal service? Yeah, they needed to have a good way to keep in touch and get commands. It's a good way to send spies. They drew up the Articles of Confederation. They directed the war to a successful end. They created a diplomatic corps. Now, the first person in that was Ben Franklin going to France to ask for help. He was our first diplomat, and he was very successful, as you saw in the little clip I showed you. They drew up the peace treaty with England when the war was over, and they wrote the Declaration of Independence. Now, those are really good things. But what were their failures? They could not raise funds any more than this First Continental Congress could. They had no help from states and no authority to require help. They couldn't tax anybody or say everybody has to give a certain amount toward the war. So they printed paper money. And they tried to do paper money instead of specie, which is hard metal money. And the people, you know, they took it, but they didn't like it too well, and it ended up eventually being totally worthless. No one would touch it. And there was a saying in our country, and I heard this as a child, it's not worth a continental. And I didn't know what that meant, it's not worth a continental. Well, it meant a continental dollar. It's not worth a continental. So that saying came from this. And number 4, they had too little authority to set up an effective government. So the key documents that they wrote were the Articles of Confederation, the Olive Branch Petition, and the Declaration of Independence. All that happened after the first shot was fired. Okay? And the first thing, the key document from the first one was the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And let's see, where was the Olive Branch Petition? When I said that the Second Continental Congress, when they got together, still would have liked to have worked things out, that's when they sent the last gesture of peace. After the first shot was fired, they sent the Olive Branch Petition. So that should be on our list too as a key document. Okay, so if I quizzed you on these two, I think you could just use logic to answer most of them and not do what I did while I was lecturing and say the First Continental Congress supplied ammunition and stuff, because the war hadn't even started during the First Continental Congress. It didn't start until 1775 when the first shot was fired, and then they had to respond and they had to have ammunition. So if you remember when they started, don't you think you could guess the rest just by using logic? It would fall into either before the war or after the war. The only two that could be confusing is the first peace document, Declaration of Rights and Grievances, where they were reaching out and trying to settle it peacefully, was first, from the First Continental Congress. The last one, the Olive Branch Petition, was a last-ditch effort to try and create peace with Britain. So, all right, now let me see if that's all I wanted to tell you about today. I know it's hard, but I noticed on tests people were always baffled about which thing went with which Congress. Do you feel a little more clear on that now? Okay. 1 through 8. All right. So, is that it? Let me see if I had anything else on there. I wanted to simplify. Oh, I know what it is. There were a few other words on the definitions that you should know. The first one is confederacy. A confederacy is a form of government in which independent states are loosely joined. That's what you said, Tony. Typically for the common defense. For the common defense. They join together for defense. And then the second thing on there was the 2 Continental Congresses. And then it went to some other things. It went to Anti-Federalists and Federalists and the Federalists. Can you tell me what those mean? The Anti-Federalists, do they want a strong government or a weak government? Okay, everybody knows it was weak, right? Is that what that means, weak? Okay. And the Federalists wanted what? Strong central government. What was in parentheses a document called the Federalist? It was sometimes called the Federalist Papers. Do you know what those were? They were a series of essays, and you know, they didn't tell who was writing it, when they were writing it, but I believe it was John Jay and Monroe. But anyway, these were papers that were published, articles that went in the paper that talked about why we should have a government, a strong government. And they had persuasive articles, and after they'd been published, they were put together in a book called The Federalist. And they were very influential. Later compiled into a single volume entitled The Federalist, the collection of essays is considered to be one of the most important articulations of the American political philosophy. So there you go. And then ratification. Does everyone know what ratification means? Okay, to approve. And the last one was Hamilton's economic program, and we're going to talk about that a little more tomorrow. Does anyone have any question on the two Congresses? No, what's your question?
Are we having a quiz on this tomorrow?
On the Congresses, yes. I don't know if we meet tomorrow. Next time we meet. So with this funny schedule, we skip tomorrow and we meet Thursday. Yep, quiz on,
Yeah, we meet Friday for an hour.
yeah. It says, look online, it says quiz on points 1 through 8 or page 4 through 6 in the Revolutionary Review. Oh, I hope I picked the pages from yours and not from mine. Oh, I might have had the pages wrong, so I'll check that. Because I have a lot more written in my notes. Yes? Yeah.